familiar faces online, including folks from my days in Philadelphia. I'm thinking of Dr. Alavi, Dr. Mohsen Alavi, very good friend and one of the pioneers there in the community. Then also, of course, Professor Kelly James Clark, really well-known philosopher of science, and written a beautiful book that'll touch on some of the same themes. I'll touch on some of the themes that Dr. Clark discussed in his recent book, God and the Brain. It's really very relevant to the discussion here tonight. So tonight I wanted to focus on the theory of Darwinian evolution, and I wanted to give an Islamic perspective. Very intentional, not saying the Islamic perspective or Islamic perspective, because what I want to really highlight here tonight is that there are many different perspectives, but I'm going to give one particular perspective here tonight. So, why discuss evolution? I think there's many important reasons to discuss Darwinian evolution. But really, in many ways, the concept of Darwinian evolution has been used by certain individuals as almost a litmus test, as a test to test one's intelligence. This is a famous quote from the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins, and Dr. Clark discusses Dawkins in his book, God and the Brain. But Richard Dawkins, many years ago, in a book review for the New York Times, wrote the following. He says, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." Very powerful words that really, paint evolution, and specifically Darwinian evolution, as an absolute unassailable fact, and then paints individuals that may disagree with certain aspects of it as being ignorant, stupid, or insane. So it's almost as if evolution is gone beyond the level of science and data and risen to the level of dogma when you have this type of statement. And obviously, this type of statement has triggered pretty significant counter reactions and counter beliefs. One manifestation of this type of reaction to the statements of Richard Dawkins are the works of a well-known individual, Harun Yahya. Harun Yahya is a interior designer by training, but he's risen to prominence, particularly among certain sectors of the Muslim world, in places like Turkey, and in fact, even in the United States. If you go to many Muslim bookstores, you'll find copies of Harun Yahya's work. And so what does Harun Yahya talk about? First of all, he takes a very creationist position towards the world. He says that the world was created in its absolute final form, and his book, Atlas of Creation, is essentially a series of arguments where he presents evidence for why fossils are not authentic, and why the world is really thousands of years, and that this is really the Islamic perspective. So really the objective of tonight's discussion is to demonstrate that neither Dawkins nor Harun Yahya are correct. So Dawkins, in his absolute belief of all aspects of Darwinian evolution, is in fact incorrect. And Dawkins and his belief that science and the belief in God are incompatible, that's incorrect. But on the other end of the spectrum, individuals like Harun Yahya and many Christian or Jewish or Muslim creationists are also incorrect of their perception of the world. And really, both camps are very similar to each other if you think about it, because they tend to be very absolute in their worldview and lack intellectual humility. So it's within that context and within that background that tonight I wanted to discuss, what does Islam say about evolution? And here I put Islam in quotes because, as we all know, Islam as a governing system, or as a divine system of belief, that's authentic and pure, and that's the system that's been established throughout the universe. But Islam, in the practical sense, in terms of Muslims practicing Islam, tends to be an imperfect manifestation of the perfect system. So, here I put the word Islam in quotes because really what I'm going to present to you here tonight is my interpretation and the interpretation of Muslims of what Islam or the system of Islam says about evolution. But obviously this interpretation is going to be filled with imperfections and inaccuracies. And so whatever inaccuracies and imperfection I may communicate here tonight, I really want it to be taken as a reflection of my incomplete understanding and not as a reflection of the religion or the system of Islam, the authentic system to which all of the universe sort of submits. So I wanted to break down the conversation into 5 parts. First, I wanted to give a background about Islam and the scientific enterprise, really highlight some of the important traditions and Quranic verses that emphasize the scientific enterprise. Then I want to get into a definition of terms. So as you can probably conclude, evolution tends to be a very political subject, and as such, a lot of the terms are actually filled with a lot of political baggage. So I want us to level set our understanding, and I'll do that by defining some of the key terms, just so that we're all using the same vocabulary and same language. Then I wanted to talk about the beliefs in creationism, Darwinism, and the history of evolution within Islam, the different strains of evolutionary thought within the Islamic intellectual tradition. Then beobviously, when we talk about evolution, oftentimes the people, they're not really thinking about evolution of like beetles or insects or bacteria. Really, it's more of a teleological discussion about the implications of evolution and its relevance to humanity. And then I'll close with some final thoughts. And even though I have slides here tonight, please feel free to interrupt and to ask questions, or if you need anything to be clarified, please feel free to jump in. So the first part, Islam and the scientific enterprise. One thing that I want to emphasize is that the Qur'an, the Muslim holy book, is not a science book. And this is an important point because many modern day Muslims, they look to the Qur'an for scientific truth. Now, science is a continuously evolving enterprise. It's not a perfect enterprise. And as such, human knowledge is always evolving and changing, and science books tend to change with that knowledge. So for example, here you have a typical college textbook, biology by Campbell, which is taught across universities. And you can see that there are many different editions. So each year, with increasing knowledge, you'll get a different edition. There you have the 10th edition, which is different from the 11th edition. The Qur'an, by contrast, the content of the Qur'an has remained unchanged for over 1,400 years. So since its revelation, it has remained the same. And so the implication here is that given that it is the divine word of the Almighty, the truths that are contained in the Quran are universal and are not continually changing. Whereas biology books, chemistry books, physics books, books that reflect the scientific enterprise, they need to change in accordance with the data. So, even though the Quran is not a scientific book, the Quran, however, does encourage scientific thinking. And this is an important point to emphasize. if you look at the Qur'an in terms of its content, there are roughly 250 verses in the Qur'an that talk about legislative or prescriptive verses. So these are verses that talk about, for example, fasting during the month of Ramadan, or praying during the day, the method of prayer. These are the verses that talk about the poor's alms, or the tax, the zakat. So there's roughly 250 verses in the Quran that discuss what we would call legalistic or fiqh issues. By contrast, the Quran contains 750 verses related to nature and natural phenomena. And it's really interesting because when you look at the Quran, you'll have chapters of the Quran that are named after natural phenomena or things found in nature. For example, there's a verse, there's a chapter called the chapter of the bee, Surah An-Nahl. There's the chapter of the spider, Surah Al-Ankabut. There's the chapter of the ant, Surah An-Naml. But there is no chapter called, for example, the chapter of the khums, which is the alms or the tithing that the Muslims need to give. There is no chapter called Surah al-Salat, or the chapter of Salat. So what this suggests is that really the Quran was revealed in part to encourage humanity to think about natural phenomena, and as such, if you extend it further, really laying the foundation of the modern scientific enterprise. So here's one example that I think is reflective of these types of verses in the Quran that really encourage humanity to think about nature and natural phenomena. This occurs in chapter 21, verse 30, where the Almighty says, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتَقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. And here the Almighty is talking about how the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit. أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ كَانَتَا رَتَقًا. They were joined together as one unit before we clove them asunder. So here in the modern sensibility, if I'm looking at this verse, I would say, well, I wonder, is this verse talking about the phenomenon of the Big Bang, where the universe was really a singular, mass of energy that just, sort of exploded and led to the expanding universe? I mean, this is really the type of question that one should ask when reciting the Qur'an. And I noticed that when I joined the session tonight, one of the verses was talking about the creation of man, how man was nothing but a clot of blood. And these are the types of verses that are found throughout the Quran. And just building on that, throughout the Quran, you'll find that there's a command to pursue observation and critical thinking, meaning don't accept things just because your parents or ancestors have accepted them. Rather, the believer, the one that is seeking the truth seeker, should always be continually questioning their own assumptions and always pursuing knowledge, even if that knowledge is overturning previous assumptions. For example, in Surah Isra, chapter 17, the Almighty says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلَّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Do not pursue that which you have no knowledge. Indeed, the hearing, the sight, and the heart, about all of those, one will be questioned. So here, the idea is that just simply because your parents or your ancestors believed in a certain set of beliefs doesn't mean that you should believe in them. In fact, you'll be held accountable for those beliefs that you hold with which you've not really reflected upon. And in fact, the Almighty goes on to talk about the aspects of the true believer. The true believer is not someone who just simply prays or simply fasts, But the Almighty says, الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض. Those who remember Allah, the Almighty, standing, sitting, and lying down on their sides, and think deeply about the creation of the heavens and the earth. So here, these are just two of the verses found throughout the Qur'an that really command the believer to pursue observation and critical thinking in terms of nature, in terms of the creation, and in terms of one's connection to the Almighty. Now, why is that important? If you look at the history of Islamic intellectual thought, it's this type of philosophy that really triggered a lot of the early believers to lay down the foundations of what we would call today the modern scientific enterprise. One such individual who's been recognized in the history of science is a man named Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. So this is back in 1999 at the turn of the millennium. The New York Times put together a list of experts asking them, who had the most important idea of the past millennium. And this set of experts, philosophers, scientists, social scientists, etc., they came to the conclusion that the most important idea of this millennium was set in motion by a man named Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. Now, why is that? Because Ibn al-Haytham, in certain histories of science, is credited with laying the foundation for the modern scientific enterprise or the scientific method. Now, there's some debate among historians of science. Some would say it's Roger Bacon. Others would say it's Ibn al-Haytham. Others would say maybe it goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. But what was Ibn al-Haytham's contribution? If you look at Ibn al-Haytham's contribution, he lived around 965 of the Common Era. And he was really a specialist in trying to understand the concept of vision. So the prevailing idea at the time is that your eyes or the eyeballs were shooting out rays of light that would capture the essence of objects. And so that's how we would visualize things. Essentially, light was coming out of our pupils, coming out of our eyeballs, and really capturing an image as if it was a camera. Ibn al-Haytham reasoned that, that's not, he questioned that prevailing attitude. So what he did is he created a scientific apparatus, or he created an experimental apparatus that enabled him to test that hypothesis. And what he did is he said, okay, well, if the light is coming out of the eyeballs, then it has to, meet these following assumptions. But, what he ended up concluding is that, in fact, the way that we perceive vision is not the rays of light aren't coming from our eyes, but rather they're reflecting off of an object and then going into our eyes. And he did this through 7 basic steps, which today are the foundations of the scientific method. They include observation, statement of the problem, formulation of the hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, analyzing the experimental results, then interpreting the data, and publishing the findings. Now, why do I mention, Ibn al-Haytham? Ibn al-Haytham was pursuing the scientific method from a foundation of trying to get closer to the Almighty, trying to get closer to God. So if you look at Ibn al-Haytham's writings, they were very much, his philosophy on life was very much, informed by trying to understand nature so that he could get closer to God Almighty. It was a very different, basic objective compared to a lot of the modern scientific enterprise. And just one last thing, I work here in Boston. My office is in Cambridge, on the campus of MIT. MIT has this wall of important scientific figures, and Ibn al-Haytham is at the top of that wall in building number 10, just really highlighting that at a place like MIT, Ibn al-Haytham is considered really an important individual. And there are many other important Islamic figures that really used the concept of critical thought and constant reflection and observation as a means to connecting with God. So rather than science being a vehicle for taking people away from God, which is the prevailing attitude of people like Lawrence Krauss or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, thinking that science and faith are incompatible. If you look at a lot of the original or early scientists like Ibn Haytham, like Ibn Tufayl, even like Isaac Newton, really a lot of these individuals were using their scientific pursuits as a way to get to a higher and a more ultimate truth, which is the truth of the metaphysical, the unseen, the invisible realities that underpin the universe. So, one other figure that I wanted to mention, and he's an important figure in the foundations of the European Enlightenment, is a man named Ibn Tufayl, who came a couple of hundred years after Ibn Haytham. And Ibn Tufayl wrote this parable. It's called Hay ibn Yaqdan, which means, it's the awake, Hay meaning awake, Ibn Yaqdan meaning Hay, the awakened, the son of the awakened. So it's a parable of this little boy who's born into a pack of wild animals. This little boy never gets taught by his parents because he lacked parents. He was raised by essentially wolves and a pack of wild animals. But because this little boy named Hay ibn Yaqdan was, gifted with the natural gift of thought, Hay ibn Yaqdan was able to achieve deeper truths, but just simply by observing nature. So Ibn Tufayl wrote this parable as an idea of saying that even if you're not born with the greatest of lineages, or even if you're not really taught the way to pursue truth, humans are created with this desire to seek truth. And this is really a parable that was discussed. I would urge all of you to read the book. It's not very long, but it's an important book, and really it's been thought to contribute to the roots of the European Enlightenment. I would urge you to look at this book, which talks about the impact of Ibn Tufayl and his book Hay ibn Yaqdan on individuals like Averroes, Leibniz, the Quakers, Newton, Kant, Rousseau, among others. It's an important book. So having said that, in the first part, what I really wanted to emphasize is that Islam and the Qur'an, although they're not scientific books, really the foundations of being a believer in the Islamic worldview is to seek critical thought, to always be thinking critically and to reflect on nature, to really the bedrocks and the foundations of modern science. So having said that, let's jump into some definitions about some of the concepts that we'll be discussing for the remainder of the talk. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that this is the common popular depiction of evolution. However, this is not evolution. Evolution is not that you have one creature that then morphs over time into being another creature. This is a popular depiction of evolution, but when we talk about evolution by natural selection, we don't mean this. So what do we mean? Biological evolution, really there's, I would say, three main categories that you need to be aware of. Biological evolution, meaning descent with modification, meaning each generation is going to be genetically different from the previous generation. And this occurs on two levels. At the micro level, it's manifested in changes in gene frequency in a population from one generation to the next. So maybe in one generation, you'll have a certain set of genetic attributes through mixing and through marriage and sexual reproduction. The genetic frequency tends to change in a population over time until it leads to something significant, which leads to the the arising of a different species from a common ancestor over many generations. So this occurs on the near-term scale, as macroevolution occurs on the more what we would call geologic scale. So in modern times, I think the best example of evolution in action is the coronavirus. All of us are being affected by the coronavirus pandemic. It's really a great example of how this simple, set of nucleic acids. That's, as you know, viruses are not living things. They're really just set of nucleic acids that encode for various genes that encode for genes that encode for proteins. The simplest of organisms, really not an organism, but the simplest of, sub-organisms, really, if you follow it over time, represents a very nice model for detecting evolution over time. So as I mentioned, the coronavirus contains about 30,000 letters of RNA, which is significantly smaller than the human genome, which is about 3 million base pairs long. So if you take a look at, 3 billion. So if you take a look at the total number of the evolution of the coronavirus from December to April, what you'll notice here is that with each of these lines, it depicts an amino acid substitution in the coronavirus genome. And so what, this particular data set was evaluating the genes or the genomes, the genetic material of 4,400 coronavirus genomes from December to April. And what you can see is over time, there's a change in the gene frequency manifested in amino acid changes in a population from one generation to the next. So here generations are measured over time. As you can see over time, there's a really measurable difference in the coronavirus genome. And really a lot of this difference is limited by, geographic locations. So, some of these genetic changes may actually give a selective advantage to the virus and may even eventually yield to a very different species. So one paper that came out recently looked at one change in the coronavirus genome, a one base mutation from D to G. So if you look at the early coronaviruses from January all the way to April, the predominant base that was around was this D. But then over time, and more recently, it's this other more predominant mutation that's taken over the virus in circulation. And they think that this mutation makes the virus more transmissible. So it's not a completely different species of virus, but what this suggests is that this one amino acid change over time, if we were to pick this up maybe a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, maybe this one modification will lead to a brand new species of coronavirus rather than COVID-19, maybe some other genetically related ancestor. Descendant of the common ancestor. So I think, looking at coronavirus really demonstrates the concepts of microevolution and macroevolution. And just a few other terms worth considering here. All living things, whether they are a virus, whether they are a bacteria, whether a fungus or an insect or a plant or a human, all of us are subject to and the product of variation and selection. So variation are the things like changes in genes, polymorphisms due to mutations. So exposure to UV or other chemicals will lead to these random base pair changes that'll lead to changes over time. These are oftentimes driven by genes themselves and by the environment. So that's just intrinsic random mutation and variation that's a result of both the environment and elements within the genetic code. But then there's variation that's due to selection. For example, natural selection, sexual selection, artificial selection. With natural selection, one example that I'll give you, and here we're looking at selection on the individual group, species, and higher level. Again, going back to coronavirus, we noticed that with coronavirus, many people are infected, but the symptoms that they manifest really are on a spectrum. Some people, eventually die from the coronavirus infection, whereas others have essentially asymptomatic manifestations of the disease. So here, a lot of this manifestation of the disease outcome is a product of human immune systems. And so over time, what the virus is going to do is it's going to select for populations that can tolerate the virus and can control the virus in a more, in a tighter way. That's the type of population pool that'll probably survive over time. And we notice that this is pretty typical of all humans as well. So if you look at the human genetic code, people have estimated that roughly 6% of human genetic elements derive from retrovirus infections through time. So we have these endogenous retroviral elements in our genetic code, which have essentially integrated into our DNA and may be a reflection of prior infections. So the point that I'm saying is that really, in addition to variation, all of us are subjected to natural selection and other drivers that lead to variety that then over time lead to the development of different species and different organisms. So having said that, I'll transition into the third part, where I wanted to talk a bit more about creationism, Darwinism, and the history of evolution within Islam. And what I wanted to do here is really address three common creationist criticisms of evolution. So this is, criticisms brought forth by someone like Harun Yahya or others that say that the earth is only, thousands of years old, that humans were created in this form that we see, and that there's been no change over time. So I wanted to address some of those common creationist criticisms of evolution, and I wanted to do it by looking at some of the Islamic intellectual literature and some of the verses from the Qur'an. So the first creationist criticism of evolution, of Darwinian evolution, is that the earth is thousands of years old. So this is a criticism by people like Harun Yahya. They say dinosaur fossils are incorrect. They're created. Someone planted them in the environment. That they're completely bogus because the earth in its essence is thousands of years old. And some people, literalist Christians, literalist Jews, will interpret the Bible and the Old Testament as essentially saying that the earth is thousands of years old. This is a very literalist interpretation. Some Muslims as well, when they look at the Qur'an. What does the Qur'an actually say? If you look at the Qur'an, one of the key themes that emerges is that time is relative. So our conception of time is very different from the universal conception of time, which is very different from God's conception of time. So here, for example, in the Qur'an, chapter 22, verse 47, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ يَوْمًا عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ كَأَلْفِ سَنَةٍ مِمَّا تَعُدُّونَ. And indeed, a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of those which you count. There, the idea is that, we can't say that the earth is thousands of years old because our conception of time doesn't necessarily align with God's conception of time or with the universal conception of time. And in fact, if we look at the actual geological time, we notice that humans are recent. So I'm sure many of you have seen this type of depiction. If you consider the origins of the earth as a 24-hour time period. And so this is a clock 24-hour time period at about so starting at zero, starting at midnight, and then going all the way through a day. If you condense all of the Earth's history into a 24-hour period, you'll notice that 400 to 700 million years after the emergence of the Earth, we have bombardment by comets and asteroids. Then we have the emergence of bacteria, roughly 1.7 billion years. into the history of the Earth, which is about, roughly it would be equivalent to 9 o'clock in the morning. Then we have the first, plants and life emerging at about 3.5 billion years in the history of the Earth, which is equivalent to 6:40 or around 7 p.m. at night. The first fish or the first boned animals with a backbone appear 4 billion years into it. First dinosaurs, 4.27 billion years. First mammals, 4.3 billion years. Humans, the genus Homo, which is the ancestor of modern humans, appeared at the interval of 2359. So essentially, 1 second before midnight, before the 24-hour time period. And modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared at the time point of 23 at 59 seconds and 56 milliseconds. So essentially, very recent in the history of the Earth. Now, this is a very when you look at this, this is a very humbling chart, because it shows that humans are not, in fact, the center of the universe, but in fact, humans only recently emerged based on the geological evidence. If you look at the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes this point, where Allah in Surah Al-Dahr or Surah Al-Insan says, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. Has there not come upon man a period of time when he was not a thing even mentioned? Think about that. Here the Almighty is challenging humanity, almost challenging humans' self-conception or self-arrogance to think, oh human, have you not considered that for a long period of time you were not even a thing mentioned? If you look at the geological evidence, it really emphasizes this point, that for a very long period of time, humans were not even existent, not even a thing worth mentioning in the grand scheme of the universe. So, this first criticism of many creationists, like Harun Yahya, the earth is thousands of years old, we would respond by saying, according to the Qur'an and the Islamic intellectual tradition, time is relative, and even within the grand scheme of universal time, humans are only recently emerged in the grand scheme of things. Now, the second, criticism is that organisms are not derived from a common ancestor, meaning humans are very special, and that even despite the fact that we share the same, base pairs as, bananas or corn, or, we all have the same genetic code, ATGC. Despite that it's impossible for organisms to be derived from a common ancestors. If you look at the Qur'an, there's numerous statements that would suggest that every creature has been created from the same overall substrate. So here, for example, in chapter 24, verse 45, the Almighty says, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَ كُلَّ دَابَّةٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. And Allah has created every animal from water. فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَمْشِي عَلَى بَطْنِهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَمْشِي عَلَى رَجِلَيْنِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَمْشِي عَلَى أَرْبَعٍ يَخْلُقُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. There are some that creep on their bellies, some that walk on 2 legs, and some that walk on 4, and that the Almighty creates what He wills, for verily Allah has power over all things. Here the idea is that all living creatures come from this single primordial substance. Here it's discussed as water, but I think if you take a look at, deeper, it's interesting how, then it goes on to say from this singular substance, water here in this case, you have all of these, tremendous diversity emerging. And in fact, it's interesting. There's a book by a famous medieval Muslim scholar called Kitab al-Mahsul by an individual named Muhammad al-Naqshbandi. So he's a well-known individual from the Fatimid period. And, Heinz Holm has written about him in his book, The Fatimids and Their Tradition of Learning. Kitab al-Mahsul, which was considered an important scientific and treatise at the time, mentions that while man has sprung from sentient creatures, these have sprung from vegetal beings, and these in their turn from combined substances, these from elementary qualities, these from celestial bodies, these from the universal soul. So, in terms of Islamic theology and Islamic intellectual thought, this concept that modern organisms all emerged from a common ancestor was not unheard of. So, the second criticism, that organisms are not derived from a common ancestor, we would say that there are many verses in the Qur'an that actually speak against that concept, and I've listed some of them. But even if you look at the Islamic intellectual tradition, like Kitab al-Mahsud, among many others, these were themes that were accepted among many of the mainstream believers at the time. Now, the final, point, and we could spend many weeks on this. By the way, I know that I'm approaching this from a very high level, from a very superficial level, but this is just really the point here tonight, is to articulate some of the themes, and really to encourage all of you to do your own research. But so, having said that, the third creationist argument against evolution, that organisms, especially humans, have fixed forms, meaning Homo sapiens, modern humans, are the same humans that have existed since the beginning of the advent of humanity on Earth. In fact, if you look at many of the intellectual traditions of famous Muslim scholars, one of the concepts that emerges is that organisms are continually adapting and changing. So there's a well-known tradition in the Shia tradition from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, where he's talking to his companion, a man named Mufaddal. This is found in Bihar al-Anwar. This is the tradition of Mufaddal. So Mufaddal was one of the companions of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he was feeling down one day because he had gotten into an argument with an atheist, and that atheist was speaking with Mufaddal and arguing about the existence of God. Mufaddal went to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq recited to him the tradition which has become known as the tradition of Mufaddal in the book Bihar al-Anwar, where Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq talks about, for example, how organisms are continually adapting and conforming to their environment. Essentially, the concept of natural selection, and building on that, subsequent Muslim thinkers like Al-Jahil. Al-Jahil was a well-known Muslim scholar who's written a tremendous multi-volume work called Kitab al-Hayawan, the book of the animal. And he used to live in southern Iraq, and he's called Al-Jahil. Al-Jahil means the one with the bulging eyes. So that was his nickname, Al-Jahil. And if you could see here, this is from a painting of Al-Jahil. It was a dark-skinned individual with these bulging eyes. But in the book Kitab al-Hayawan, he discusses the concept of the mechanism of evolution, how all organisms struggle for existence, and how the struggle for existence leads to the transformation of species, and this transformation of species is driven by things including animal factors. And in fact, Rebecca Stott has written a really nice book called Darwin's Ghost, The Secret History of Evolution. And in this book, Rebecca Stott talks about how Darwin, in his concept of evolution by natural selection, really leaned heavily on works that came prior to him. So works like Kitab al-Hayawan from Al-Jahil. And if you look at Kitab al-Jahil or Kitab al-Hayawan, the book of the animal, Al-Jahil talks about, for example, animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to offspring. So, here the idea that, I wanted to emphasize is that, this third creationist criticism of evolution from people like Harun Yahya, that organisms, especially humans, have fixed forms, in fact, runs counter to the prevailing Muslim intellectual tradition that was around during the time of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, during the time of al-Jahil, and really a lot of these ideas had influence on folks like Charles Darwin. So in the final part, I wanted to talk about, okay, well, that's great, but how does that impact us as humans, human evolution? And, okay, some people will say, well, evolution maybe is applicable to the smaller creatures like insects or viruses or others, but humans are special, and we're created exactly in the same form, and we've always been in the same form. And now, if you look at the Qur'an and early Islam, one of the verses that would suggest a different viewpoint is this verse from verse 71, verse 14, chapter 71, where here the Almighty is saying, وَقَدْ خَلَقْنَاكُمْ أَطْوَارًا. Now here, seeing that it is He that has created you in diverse stages. Now here, one interpretation of this verse is that the diverse stages that's talked about is the diverse fetal stages. So we're initially created as a zygote, or we initially come out as a sperm and an egg. When the egg gets fertilized, it'll develop into a zygote, then an embryo. So the diverse stages here is talking about, the diverse stages in the womb. But another interpretation is maybe diverse stages in terms of the human shape and the human form over time. And in fact, there's a couple of well-known traditions from important Muslim thinkers. One of them, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and the other from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And these are all discussed. You can find these traditions in Bihar al-Anwar, but they're also discussed by Allama Tabatabai in his chapter on eschatology from the book Shi'ism, Doctrines, Thoughts, and Spirituality. So from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he talks about the creation or the emergence of mankind. It says, God the Exalted, since creating the world, has created 7 kinds, none of whom were the race of Adam. So there were 7 different humanoid creatures prior to Adam, prior to what we would consider modern Homo sapiens that were existing on earth. And he created them from the surface of the earth and set them being one after another with its kind upon earth. Then he created Adam, the father of mankind, and brought his children into being from him. So here, in a very I would say very symbolic way, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam is talking about how there were many different humanoid forms on earth, and then eventually Adam, or modern Homo sapiens, would emerge as being the predominant one. And in fact, building on that, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and again, you can find this in many of the books of hadith or the books of narration, where Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq says, perhaps you think God has not created a humanity other than you. No, I swear to God that He has created thousands upon thousands of mankinds, and you are the last among them. And again, Allama Tabatabai talks extensively about these 2 ahadith. Now, in more contemporary times, there's been a few other discussions about, have Muslims misunderstood evolution? So, we have the depiction of people like Harun Yahya, who tries to create a very creationist and a literalist interpretation of humanity. But, Muslim scholars and thinkers and intellectual thinkers are going back and saying, well, have Muslims misunderstood evolution? And are they just co-opting the creationist narrative without really truly understanding the Islamic intellectual legacy there? And so, 2 groups of thinkers that I would urge you to all read about are Allama Behishti and Bahonar. They were really important philosophical and sociological figures in the history of early, the Republic of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran. And they've written a book, Philosophy of Islam, where they talk about the concept of evolution. They talk about the emergence of man on the basis of evolution from other primates. is not in conflict with the teachings of the revealed religions, especially with the belief of an almighty creator of the world. So I think it's this, and incidentally, the principles of evolution are still subject to further scientific investigation, for they are faced with much criticism, especially as they were enunciated by Darwin. And why am I, including this quote? I'm including this quote because I think this really gets to the essence of the matter, that evolution as a scientific concept, there's nothing inherently antithetical to the belief in God. But at the same time, evolution, because it's a scientific concept, the concept is continually evolving. So evolution the current models of evolution may tell us something important about, the physical origins of humanity, but it tells us, nothing about the spiritual, the intellectual, and the moral origins of humanity. And just to highlight this point that they're making here, that the principles of evolution are still subject to further scientific investigation, I wanted to give you one story recently that happened that has really upturned the fundamental tenet of evolutionary theory, and just highlights how evolutionary theory is always changing. And that's the emergence of this skeleton called Ardi. So prior to the discovery of Ardi in Australia, the idea was that there was, humans derived from a chimp-like ancestor. So we had, our closest ancestor was a chimp, and then from that chimp emerged the modern genus of Homo, which led to Homo sapiens. But this discovery of this other fossil back in 2009 actually overturns that concept. And it is an important point. And, here, this is from the popular press. But if you look at the initial discussion of the discovery of Ardi in the journal Science, they talk about this in a technical matter. But here, they mention that the fossil or the discovery of Ardi puts to rest the notion, popular since Darwin's time, that a chimpanzee-like missing link, resembling something between humans and today's apes, would eventually be found at the root of the human family tree. Indeed, the new evidence suggests that the study of chimpanzee anatomy and behavior, long used to infer the nature of the earliest human ancestors, is largely irrelevant to understanding our beginnings. So the reason that I mention that is a lot of people like Dawkins, when they talk about evolution, and, if you don't believe in evolution, you're insane or you're, irrational or whatever, they assume that evolution is a foregone conclusion. This is a great example of how, evolutionary biology, just like every other field of science, whether it's virology or immunology or chemistry or physics, is continually changing. And, the models that we may have had 50 years ago can be upturned by the discovery of a new species. And this is just for those that are interested. This was the cover of Science back in 2009 when they discovered Ardi. And Ardi is thought to be the closest ancestor to humans. Here, saying re-examining human origins in light of Ardipithecus ramidus. So having said all of that, what can religion offer, and what can the belief of God offer that science and the scientific enterprise doesn't offer? Well, what I would argue is that really, despite the fact that we may share biological origins with many of the creatures and the creations, at the end of the day, humans are unique, and there are certain limits that evolution cannot explain. In fact, the Qur'an, if you look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And they ask you about the soul. Say the soul is one of the commands of my Lord, and you are not given aught of knowledge but a little. Meaning here, this metaphysical characteristic of being human, which we define as the soul. Really, science and modern empirical methods tell us very little about the concept of the soul. And this is something that was picked up by the other important figure in the development of evolutionary thought, Alfred Russel Wallace. So many people forget about Alfred Russel Wallace. When we talk about evolution, we call it Darwinian evolution. We name it after Charles Darwin, implying or suggesting that Darwin was the only person to describe the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. But people forget that Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace published their seminal findings at the same time. They had made, very similar observations. Darwin in the Galapagos Islands, Alfred Russel Wallace in Madagascar, but they came to very similar conclusions that there's a mechanism that enables diversity, and that mechanism is evolution by natural selection. But, Darwin, with his evidence, chose the line of non-belief or disbelief, atheism. Alfred Russel Wallace, by contrast, was a well-known religious individual, had a very mystical and a very spiritual bent to him, and he summarized it very well. The Qur'an summarized it over 1,400 years ago. Alfred Russel Wallace really echoed it 1,400 years later in his writings, where he says, nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. Mathematics is alone sufficient to prove in man the possession of the faculty unexistent in other creatures. Then you have music and the artistic faculty. No, the soul was a separate creation. And it's unfortunate that oftentimes in university settings, when I was an undergraduate, I studied evolutionary biology. So that was my degree was in evolutionary biology, and my other degree was in cell and molecular biology. I have to admit that we only heard about Alfred Russel Wallace maybe once or twice. The predominant focus was on Darwin, but I would say that people like Alfred Russel Wallace or Imam Jafar Sadiq or Sayyid Behishti or Sayyid Bahunar or Al-Jahad, among many others, give us a alternative, depiction. So, to conclude, what does Islam say about evolution? Well, I think, really the takeaway here is that Islam gives us some insights in terms of human creation and in terms of creation in nature. But at the end of the day, a lot of these things, everything that Islam says does not negate modern scientific evidence, and the scientific evidence is in many ways incomplete. And really, the main takeaway that I would hope all of you take away with you here tonight is the importance of intellectual humility and understanding that we lack a perfect understanding of how humans emerged and how the universe emerged. This knowledge is continually evolving, and really the point of being a true Muslim believer is not to believe in dogma, but rather to be in pursuit of truth continually, from through reflection and through connecting, and through connecting not just on a physical level, but understanding that truth can be manifested in many ways. One way is physical evidence, which is really the bread and butter of the scientific enterprise. But another mechanism towards attaining the truth is the metaphysical. So the things that are hidden about human creation, like the soul, like the creative faculty, like the artistic faculty. Science tells you nothing about those things. And the way that you connect to those things is by really reflecting and connecting. And those are the things that will take you closer to belief in Allah and God Almighty and the absolute creator of the universe. I hope, this has triggered some thoughts in your your mind, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments or any feedback that people may wish to share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kassim. Let's everyone to salawat for this. That was very blessing. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Thank you so much. So we open up the mic for the people. If you have questions, you can raise hands and I can manage so the questions in order. So there have been 2 questions before entering to the questions that people ask by themselves. First, Dr. Clark asked, Darwin leaned heavily on these previous thinkers. Does Scott present evidence that he had read those thinkers?
Yeah, good question. So, you know, Stott presents some indirect evidence, but it's not, you know, direct like, you know, Darwin in his writings, you know, says, well, you know, I read this and I was influenced by it. So, you know, Scoot's basic idea is that this was part of the conversation at the time, and presumably Darwin was exposed to that thinking. But, you know, it's a good point that you bring up. There is no direct, like, smoking gun that says Darwin read Al-Jahal and then, you know, formulated his idea of the Darwinian of evolution by natural selection. All right. Any other questions?
I'm silent. So Majid says that do we have concrete scientific evidence for the existence of ruh, or the spirit?
Scientific evidence for the existence of the ruh?
Yes.
Yeah, good question. I mean, you know, and you know, I know Professor Clark has written about some aspects of this, like God and the brain. But you know, I'll answer, and then you know, if Dr. Clark has any additional insights, please feel free to jump in. But in terms of the ruh, meaning the soul, you know, there's been quite a bit of work on what are called near-death experiences. So people say that during near-death experiences, you know, there's been instances where people have been able to document and discuss things that were out of body experiences. So, you know, these near-death experiences are maybe they're in a hospital and, you know, something happens that enables, you know, this non-physical self to go up above and see something, and then they come back and they're able to talk about it. So near-death experiences are one indirect, you know, physical sort of suggestion about the existence of the soul. But, you know, there's quite a bit of new studies on, you know, neurobiology, how the brain is programmed, how the brain is impacted, that suggests that humans have a almost are pre-programmed to believe in God and in a higher power, which, you know, maybe some additional indirect evidence for the existence of the soul. But, you know, in terms of direct, you know, evidence of the soul, I mean, you know, the soul is not something that can be quantified or measured. But I think, you know, that's something that we need to take into consideration. Like, you know, we as humans, especially as scientists, are trained to be materialists, meaning if I can measure it, if I can quantify it, it's a reflection of absolute truth. But if you look at the universe, there's something called dark matter and dark energy. The 2011 Nobel Prize was about this concept. There's a well-known book called The 4% Universe. So the idea here is that if you were to take all of the atoms on Earth and you know, the things that can be measured, atoms, you know, objects, and if you were to weigh all of those, they would constitute 4% of the universe. The other 96% of the universe, which is composed of dark matter and dark energy, is really beyond our ability to measure. It's immeasurable. So, you know, what do we say? But we know that they exist. We know dark energy and dark matter exist because we've derived or we've deduced that they need to exist in order for the physical world to exist. And I would suggest, or I would put forth a very similar analogy towards the soul. So yes, maybe we're unable to measure the soul. Maybe we're unable to quantify the soul. But that inability to measure and quantify is not the evidence of the absence of the soul. So, you know, I know it's a bit of a roundabout way to answer your question. I don't know if there's any other insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Clark has gave a comment that I have a question about the evolution of the soul. So if Dr. Clark can unmute yourself and ask it directly, please.
I just had a question on the Wallace part. And this gets back, other people have asked, like, what is the soul? And maybe it's, Hashem said, maybe it's consciousness, and maybe it's our psychological part that's, anyway, it's hard to know exactly what the soul is. And just the one quick issue I wanted to raise, Sadik, is the claims that Alfred Russel Wallace made about like mathematics, for example. Well, mathematics didn't really come about, for the first 199,000 years of human existence. Humans could probably count and maybe do some elementary arithmetic, but mathematics, you don't have the calculus, you don't have algebra, you don't have modern science. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then and maybe some other things. At any rate, and then you find out, and this, so Darwin's Descent of Man is really interesting in this regard. And it just starts to make you think about sort of soulish things, how they evolved, like how primates, there are probably primates that had some sense of, I don't know exactly what they had. It seems like they have sense of beauty. Some people think they have sense of, that some primates have do rituals. Honestly, I think a lot of this is overrated, but I think a lot of it's really cool too, because I think we're creatures, and they're creatures who evolved. And so there will be lots of similarities psychological similarities between us and pre-existing animals. At any rate, the Alfred Russel Wallace quote made me think, if you're really interested in this, Darwin's Descent of Man is absolutely astounding and making you think, human beings we do share a lot of common ancestors with non-human species, and what we think makes us really unique, isn't so unique. I think that's I think that's exaggerated, but it's really fascinating too.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Very, very helpful insights.
Thanks, Dr. Clark. The next question is from Said. It says that, can you, meaning that Dr. Kassim, elaborate on creation itself? Is there anything that can bridge scientists' view on creation and the Islamic view? So only the soul side is like Islamic part can put on the table. I am just elaborating what he was asking. Or like, is there more like, what is creation? When we say on the creation of human, like on the Islamic view, is it just the soul side that is different? Is there any idea proposed by the modern Muslims? It's like from the Islamic view can propose?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it really depends on how we define creation. So I think there's numerous verses in the Qur'an where the Almighty talks about how things arise. So for example, there's this well-known verse where the Almighty says kun fayakun, happen, and it arises, right? So it suggests that when humans create something, we need to have a plan. We need to measure things. We need to have like some level of preordainment in order to create something. And I think what a lot of people do is they anthropomorphize, or they project the way we create things into the way that creation or the natural world comes into being. Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and it's a very dangerous area for us to sort of speculate about, where we think about, okay, well, how did this universe emerge? Because at the end of the day, we're gonna hit a dead wall, hit a wall. Well, what was the foundation for the Big Bang? Okay, what was the ultimate source? We would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then one would say, well, how did Allah create everything, the Big Bang and everything subsequent to that? And, I haven't really seen any good model, either from scientists or from, religious folks that would really do justice to, how things arose, the first mover. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's, we really have no good model for how the universe evolved, came out of nothing. We know that there was nothing and then there was something, but how did that something come out of nothing? There's no good explanation from a scientific perspective. There's multiple ideas, and then from a religious perspective, how did God create something out of nothingness? There's very little that we can say, because God has, very different methods than human methods of creation.
Thanks, Dr. Kassim. I read Hasham's comments. There's not a question or comments. Hasham can add himself after I read his comment that perhaps the Quran means consciousness or mind by ruh and like the spirit, and no one denies the existence of consciousness like the mind, people, like academic people. And it continues that perhaps Majid is reading a specific theory of consciousness, namely substance dualism, into the term ruh. So Hasham, Dr. Morwari, do you want to add anything to your comments? Can you please unmute yourself if you want to add anything on your comment? Mr. Morwari, can you hear me? You need to unmute yourself while you voice.
Hi guys. Yes, I have to be very quick and brief. So actually Majid is reading too much into the term ruh. The Quran doesn't say that ruh is necessarily an immaterial substance. So that Majid asked the question whether we have any evidence for its existence. Maybe ruh is just one's consciousness, and we all experience this phenomenon in ourselves. We all have consciousness. We feel things. We think. We are conscious, and the Quran is saying that this very phenomenon that we are all familiar with it might be beyond our comprehension. It's not something that we can at least easily or to full extent explain. So yeah, I just wanted to say that Majid is reading too much into this term.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's the whole point of that ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, they ask you about the ruh. Say it's almost like a thing beyond your understanding. So as much as we talk about it, we're really you're not even going to scratch the surface in terms of trying to understand it.
Yeah, thanks so much. So Mr. Qassemzadeh says that, is it possible to separate the evolution of a species from the creation of human beings? So humans were created by Allah, and directly, and it is mentioned in the Quran, but other species have evolved from previous creations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make that type of argument, but then also at the same time, if you go along that path that humans, what I would say is two things. We know that human beings are special compared to all other creatures because they have this thing called the soul. We call it consciousness or whatever you call it, right? But then also the ability to speak language. This concept of discrete infinity, which Noam Chomsky has talked about, is a uniquely human phenomenon. And so if we take those two features as being uniquely human, then maybe one model would be that there was some sort of humanoid creature on earth, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as is mentioned in the Qur'an, nafakha, he blew part of his ruh into humanity, and that ruh that was blown into the human created modern mankind. So that's one possible model, and that's, I would say, supported by, for example, Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran khalaq al-insan allamahu al-bayan. So here the concept of creation of humanity is linked to the concept of language. So maybe, there was a creature on Earth that looked like humans, but we wouldn't call it insan because it lacked the ability to speak and it lacked this consciousness. And it's when Allah inspired that creature that then it transitioned from being a normal creature to a human. So, that's one model. The other model that you're proposing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, a system for evolution for all other creatures, but then with humans, just specifically created them in a very specific mold, and then, allowed them to descend onto Earth. That model is another model. It's an interesting model, but still, at the end of the day, even within that model, humans would be subjected to the mechanisms of evolution. So even if Allah creates the perfect human, Prophet Adam alayhi salam, upon placement of that perfect human on Earth, that human becomes subject to the forces of evolution. You see what I'm saying? So, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that whether Allah created humans separately from all other creatures, or whether humans were already on Earth and then were inspired by Allah, I think it's an interesting point, but really the bigger point is that in either model, humans, once they're on Earth, they become products of evolution, through natural selection, through sexual selection, through random mutations, etc. So, I think the point here is that, humans, irrespective of how they emerged on Earth, are still, modern humans are really a product of these selective pressures that lead to different variants and different forms over time.
Thank you so much. Like in support of the evolution that we had, like let's say evolution, Adam was, 70,000 years ago, like modern Homo sapiens. You have this diversity in colors of humans, like the skull shape, like height, like many diversity you already have from this 8 billion. So this clear evidence of this like level of evolution at least we have. But in support of the first, like the Adam, like the Quranic support that was not the descendant of another person, the clear comparison that Quran makes with this the parallelism between Adam and Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, is that they were both created min ghayri ab, without father. So we don't have any either to the Christian tradition and Islamic tradition, we don't have any man named the father of Adam or Eve. So this is the part that I personally am not convinced on the first human side. But of course, there were humanities, as we have the hadiths that you mentioned, the two hadiths, and we have like the hadiths about nasnas. It's like not nas, but they're nasnas, like human likes. So we had all these species, but the first, like Adam and Eve, were the peculiar intervention. I am also in a way biologist and neuroscientist, so I did 3 mouse surgeries today. So I work with all this evolution, like in this animal behavior, comparative physiology, or all of this. Just my career, but still for the case of human, like Adam and Eve, I do a stop, do a tawaqquf to go by the mainstream theory of evolution. It's my personal choice. So Brother Qazi asked, I was thinking of the watchmaker argument for intelligent design. Can one think that evolution is the means for creation by God? I figured it is not really either Darwin or creationist.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Just like gravity is the means for, enabling. Yeah, in the physical world, you have the fundamental forces like gravity, the weak forces, the strong forces, etc. So I think, natural selection or evolution by natural selection could be means for creating, new species and enabling the emergence of new species. So, it's possible. Allahu A'lam.
So we have, so let's ask, we have other questions written, but unfortunately we missed Dr. Sharon's question, but Dr. Alavi has raised his hand on the participant side. So we ask him to unmute himself and like ask his question directly, please. Dr. Alabi.
First of all, Dr. Sadik, I want to thank you. It's a pleasure to listen to you as usual. I had a lot of questions, but just for interest of the time, maybe another model or the last model we still don't know. Maybe a day will come that we know more about creation. Thank you.
No, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Alavi. I mean, Dr. Alavi is a really important figure, and really always appreciate his insights and his contributions. And it's good to see you online. And I would agree with that model. In fact, that at the end of the day, human knowledge is imperfect, and so whatever model we come up with is really a product of our imperfect understanding. So we can present these models, but at the end of the day, we have to have the intellectual humility to understand that whatever we present is actually going to be imperfect. That al-kamal 'inda Allah, the perfection belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I fully endorse that position.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I read one question, then we go back to the audience who have raised their hands. So Armin asks that is evolution or any other scientific theory capable of contradicting a religious belief or evidence anyway? Is God's order being above everything else not sufficient to solve any future problems? For instance, a lack of intelligent design in evolution can be claimed to be God's will. I do not see any way in which contradictions can even arise. Am I missing something?
No, I don't think you're missing anything. I mean, I think, the point is that scientific theories are imperfect, and that's the point that I made at the very beginning, that, you can't use science to justify your belief in God, because science is imperfect and it changes. So, they talk about, science talks about a very specific domain, whereas, the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a much more expansive system that talks about ethics, morality, behavior, the physical and the metaphysical. So, I don't think, there is no evidence that can be generated that would contradict the existence of God. I haven't seen any. I don't think you're capable of designing a study or an experiment that could overturn that belief. There's nothing that would enable you to come to such a firm conclusion. So I think no, you're not missing anything.
Yeah, thanks. So Mr. Farhad, please speak out your question, and then we go back to the written questions.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Kassim. Thank you for your talk. I felt from your speech and maybe even the last questioners that we don't want to get that everything's okay between Islam and evolution. What I want to say, the present theory of evolution as taught in the universities, I don't think is compatible not only with Islam, the way it's taught with majority universities, and neither with Islam any theistic belief, because they want to cut it high. And they want to cut between creativity and God and its creation. So, I mean, especially that naturalistic mechanism of natural selection. Although you mentioned that, okay, maybe something else is fine. And I think, maybe I'll let you explain if needed, I will add it to it. But I felt we shouldn't go out, things are very okay and very consistent, besides even the human beings. The whole naturally, those guys like Thomas Huxley, which developed modern synthesis, they really have some ideology and they put in it, so you have Dawkins and his popularity, and it's still his books as the most source of atheism, even translated in Farsi, stuff like that, because they cut very high. They cut not this text, that sentence, they cut above it. They cut that any connection between creativity of God, because even everything becomes random. Everything is so for example, I get a piece of ink and throw it on the ground, and then suddenly Mona Lisa came. Even is not that. That's my not intention to come that. But even is not that. So when even there is a God, they want one naturalistic mechanism, so they cut the whole creativity. And this should be changed. I'm not saying it's only for human beings. All the other species, they said there is no, look, for example, Stephen Jay Gould says, he passed away, which is another famous writer. He said, if we rewind the movie a few billion years ago and let it come back forward again, there is no possibility, probability that all things come back, human beings are created. So they essentially are selling that it's one time, which creation, intelligent design people argue it's very low probability. So I'm saying there is some conflict, and we have to wait a new science comes, which are some signs out of it. I don't want, let me and you discuss, and then if I think there are some signs appearing that from inside the biological science, there are new paths coming out. So one of them, let you discuss, and if I have another points, I'll add to it.
Yeah, no, I don't really have anything else to add. I agree that the way that evolution is taught and discussed, there's a ulterior political motive, like Dawkins and others, they're militant atheists, and it's a very intentional program. But the flip side of it, unfortunately, what I was trying to say here is that Muslims, rather than offering a alternative model, we become very defensive, and books like this individual Harun Yahya goes the complete opposite and says that everything was created, the universe is only like 20,000 years old, or some nonsense. So the point, and I would echo again Dr. Adawi's point, that at the end of the day, we know that humans are special. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned this throughout the Qur'an. We know that humans are obligated with a certain set of moral and intellectual and spiritual obligations, which differentiates them from everything else. But in terms of the emergence of humanity, I would say that there's a lot of missing information, and we can provide models, but at the end of the day, whatever we present is going to be imperfect. So I would rather err on not presenting something rather than presenting something which is an incomplete model, which is what many of these evolutionists present. And that's where I think your point is relevant, because when evolution is taught in the university setting, they present it as if, okay, we've solved everything, this is the absolute truth. But in fact, it's only a version of the truth that we know based on the evidence today. As more evidence emerges, a new truth will emerge, right? And so, I think that's really the main takeaway that I was hoping to present here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So far, we have 3 more questions. One would be spoken by Majid, the 2 others are written questions. So Majid, please go forward. Unmute yourself.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Kassim. And I wish Dr. Clark was still here, but I think he left the meeting. But regarding the question that I asked earlier, which was basically about having a scientific evidence about the ruh, as we call it, I think we had one of the sessions, I think it was a couple of months ago, and Haydar and some of the other folks that are here, we were talking and discussing about near-death experiences, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Haydar, but the conclusion was that we don't have still concrete evidence for those experiences yet, and we can show that those are something as kind of as an evidence for having ruh. And what I was trying to get, or maybe I was trying to ask, was basically the question that I had in mind to better understand, because I think the main argument here is that for those Darwinist people, they believe that everything is natural. There is no kind of any kind of a special power that has designed this path of humanities, and as you call it, natural selection. And you can link that with a powerful actually hand that has designed it this way. Everything, all possibilities have happened, and this is one of the possibilities that actually could resist it actually. And that's why when I was thinking about, because you were talking about the ruh and also the evolution of spirituality and also like the mathematics and some of those capabilities. But I think they say that everything is in our body, like everything is part of that evolution. So that's why I had a hard time distinguishing between the two, that if everything is in our body, then in that sense, and if we don't have any scientific evidence that any kind of like ruh, consciousness, whatever we want to call it, it doesn't exist if our body doesn't exist, then I was curious, how can we come up with a conclusion that you were trying to say that, yes, like it's more about like when you say Russell mentioned about like that part, I'm still having a hard time understanding that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. I think you bring up a lot of relevant points.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because of shortage of time, we move to the next questions. So Said says that you mentioned the previous idea on chimps being ancestors of Homo sapiens was debunked by finding Ardi. What is the hypothesis around the origin of Ardi himself? So how it changed the theory or understanding after Ardi?
Yeah, so you know, the previous models were that there was a chimpanzee, and then from that chimpanzee you have the ancestor of hominids of Homo, which then led to the emergence of Homo sapiens. So that was the model. And then with Ardi, you know, the idea here is that Ardi is genetically and physically much closer to Homo sapiens. So there's this, you know, chimp. One lineage is the emergence of chimpanzees. The other is this pre-hominid creature called Ardi, which emerged from another ancestor, which is still yet to be known. That's the current model. But again, as I mentioned, these models are imperfect because they're dependent on the available evidence. But, you know, the point that I was trying to make is that for, you know, over 50 years, the predominant model in Darwinian evolution was that we derived from a chimp-like ancestor. With the emergence of this particular fossil, now the consensus is that actually we're derived from another ancestor that is not, you know, origins are chimpanzee. It's much more similar to Homo sapiens because they found this model. So, you know, Allahu A'lam. I mean, you know, maybe in a couple of years they're going to find another ancestor that'll completely change things. You know, the point here that I was trying to make is that, again, science is a continuing enterprise. The models change with more evidence and different data sets. Whereas the Qur'an, it's the same book that's been revealed for 1400 years, no other additions. And so, you know, our responsibility is to understand the universal truth that's being discussed in the Qur'an and not the more temporary and specific truths. And you know, to be able to differentiate between the temporary and specific truths that science talks about with versus the universal truths, which is what the Qur'an talks about. So, you know, that was really the point that I was trying to make there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think Dr. Qudusi also had a follow-up question, if I correctly understand. Dr. Qudusi, do you have any question? Also, sorry, Dr. Kassim, I know it's in Boston and midnight is past, so thanks for being patient to be with us. So
I mean, what I was saying, maybe following just what we were discussing, you know, there are evidence coming from the evolution itself that maybe that totally naturalistic mechanism doesn't work. First, the other question our friend asked about the whole mental capacity, this evolutionary psychology is hot, but it's not even the whole theories of mind are very in impasse. So even understanding mind, you need some breakthrough. But even going to the biological part, look, one of the things is that we can solve it two ways, you know, as Dr. Kassim alluded. Either we need some God intervention or tweaking occasionally, which I'm not against that, and intelligent designs are there, especially as Brother Haydar said, in the creation of human beings. It's so different. Maybe there was some humanoids similar to us, but somewhere Adam, that body was taken, the spirit was blown in it, and Adam came out. okay, this is intelligent designs people go. So basic structure is evolution, but some tweaking by the God in the way to guide it. But the other way some people want is all law-based. You know, some of these Catholic theologians all law-based. But for now, this totally naturalistic, random mechanism of natural selection doesn't allow it. But that doesn't work. First, it produces very, very, very low probabilities. But the other things people are noticing, a kind of Lamarckism is coming back. You know, because that law is not even statistical. You know, some things are deterministic. If I hold a book, I drop it, it fall down. But if I put some water cup over there, it will evaporate. But which molecules go out, I don't know. Which part of the cup, if I tag the molecules, maybe this molecule, that molecule, I don't know. But if I wait 2 days, the cup will evaporate. So it is statistical. Still statistical laws are laws. That natural mechanism selection allows blocks both. It's purely random. Some photon somewhere can come in and hit and does the mutation. Although that photon can be sent by God, they never can deny that. But the point is this: if we can have the environment effects, can guide naturally in some generation the species towards some direction, then you can have some kind of environment. The laws of outside, you know, it's not just mutation in the genes, the environment. I'll give you the example to clarify the point. So the environment all can work together. And then, as I said, Lamarckism was out. You know, Lamarck was the guy, have the simplistic example that giraffes, you know, neck was raised, become longer because they start to eat leaves from the trees. When the leaves in the lower level goes away, he had to raise his neck higher level. So, and then the neck raised. But that we know is a little funny, because even one giraffe neck rise like that, it doesn't go to his child. You know, even you lose your eye, doesn't mean your child is blind. But there are, the new Lamarckism gives some effect for environment. So what is this? You know, they notice there are fishes trapped in different lakes in Africa. At the end, there are very different lakes, no communication, no nothing. At the end, you see the evolutionary path is more or less the same. So means the laws of evolution is not totally random, follow some statistical pattern. Maybe one takes 5 million years, the other 6 million years. In this way, you can anticipate. That I was going to say, as Stephen Jay Gould said, if you rewind a movie and let it go forward, you don't get it back. You don't get humans, you don't get dinosaurs. But if it is very good probability, if you rewind the movie and let it go forward, again, you get the same thing. You know, you put the cup of water over there, maybe evaporates 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, but it will evaporate. Oh, then this is the law-based evolutionary, which maybe the original law have everything in it. But it's still regarding humans, you always need tweaking. I see some of these Catholic theologians are really, they don't want God tweaking, but I don't see any reason God doesn't tweak. God always is sustaining the whole, always creative. So it's a combination. But I think the point is that it's coming out of the evolutionary theory. You see scientists saying this naturalistic mechanism, it doesn't explain some stuff. It still is the beginning, but I'm believing 20 years things will change. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and those are great points. And I think there's many limits with the model of natural selection or evolution by natural selection. Like, you know, for example, Noam Chomsky, well-known, you know, the father of linguistics, his model of how humans develop language is very clear, you know, and he's changed his model recently, but his original model is that it's something that just emerged all of a sudden, that, you know, there wasn't evolution by natural selection that led to the development of language. It's just something that happened, you know, somewhere during human development, which suggests that there is some divine intervention or some, you know, mechanism beyond the basic, you know, belief in randomness, to Gould's point. And I think, you know, there's other phenomenon beyond language that follow a very similar pattern. And, you know, slowly, I think a lot of the science disciplines will come to that conclusion as well, that evolution by natural selection can only take you so far, but there are more fundamental things about being human that require divine intervention or some sort of divine event that's unexplainable by evolution by natural selection. So yeah, I mean, good discussion. So Brother Haidar, let's wrap up, inshallah, if there's no other questions.
So there was the last question, but we can finish up with that. That Hamid says that how do you understand the story of Eve or Hawa? The Bible explains that she was created by Adam's rib. Does Quran confirm the equality of men and women from the evolution point of view? As far as I know, in the Islamic Hadith, we have both types, that it was created separately or it was created by the rib of Adam. So I don't know which one is more correct or more authentic Hadith, but we have both the narratives in the Islam or Shia.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if we go back to the Quran, the Quran doesn't mention Prophet Adam. Yeah, so we should always go back to the Quran, because I think a lot of the hadiths could be sort of fabricated, but in the Quran there's no mention of Eve being created of Adam's rib. In fact, the idea is that all of humanity was created from the same source. So I would say in the Quranic conception of Adam and Eve, there is no concept of Eve coming out of Adam's rib.
Yeah, true. There's nothing comes
Yeah.
really from the Quran. So thank you so much, because I know it's like almost 12:20 after midnight in Boston. So thank you so much there are many people have commented in the chat they're very appreciated for your great talk and also the discussions. So I hope we can invite you for the other occasions to benefit from your knowledge. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and iltimas dua, and it's good to see many familiar faces. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz. So Hamid, you can start.